Here, we'll provide an overview of nutrient limitation and thinking about how nutrients limit the productivity of plants in terrestrial and aquatic system. Plants require more of some nutrients than others, so not all nutrients are required in the same amounts. Those nutrients that are needed in larger quantities in plants we call macronutrients. And it's not because the nutrients themselves are larger in size, but instead it's the quantity that are needed. Micronutrients are those nutrients that are needed in smaller amounts compared to macronutrients. And again, they're essentially the same size as macronutrients, but they're needed in a lower amount than macronutrients. Table 8.1 lists the nutrients that are required by plants and some of their major functions. Now, depending on how you count things, there would be somewhere on the order of 22 macro and micronutrients that are needed by plants. And we talked about how nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are the primary macronutrients. So these are the ones that are needed in the largest quantities. But if something is essential, it doesn't necessarily matter whether you need something more or less. They're all needed. So nitrogen is a component of proteins, enzymes, phospholipids, and nucleic acids. Almost everything except those carbohydrates and carbohydrate-based substances require nitrogen to one degree or another. Phosphorus is also needed by proteins and a lot of other things like nucleic acids, and it's also critical in energy transfer, ATP. Potassium is also a component of some proteins, and there's a number of other functions that potassium performs in plants, such as being important for ion transport and osmotic regulation. Now, the other macronutrients that we talk about are calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Calcium, for example, is a component of cell walls. It gives it rigidity, for example, and magnesium is required for chlorophyll. Sulfur is also a component of proteins. There's some amino acids that have sulfur in them, and there's other functions, for example, like cold resistance with sulfur. These are the macronutrients. We have 6 macronutrients. The primary ones, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Secondary ones, calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. Now the micronutrients, those that are required in smaller amounts than macronutrients, 7 are listed here: boron, chloride, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc. And it's good to take a look at some of the roles of these micronutrients in plants. For example, iron is important for chlorophyll synthesis and oxygen transfer, whereas zinc activates some enzymes. So more important than some of the roles of these micronutrients is that they're required, and you can have limitation by each of these in plants. Now, the quantity of nutrients that cycle through vegetation depends on the dynamic balance between nutrient supply from the environment and nutrient requirements to support plant growth. So if you take a look at the pool of nutrients that are in plants, and we take a look at how much go into plants and how much go out, and then on an ecosystem level, do the same kind of analysis, but also think about within ecosystem cycling. That quantity of nutrients that are cycling really depends in part on nutrient supplies, but also the nutrient requirements for plant growth. And a lot of the cycling that occurs of the nutrients is because plants require them in different amounts. Now, there are optimal ratios of nutrients for the growth of plants. Most commonly, we might think about an N to P ratio. And if we assume the same mean residence time for nitrogen and phosphorus within a plant, then N to P ratios, so the amount of nitrogen and the amount of phosphorus that's found within a plant, tells you the rates at which they need to be supplied, and also the rates at which they are lost. So an optimal ratio, N to P ratio for a plant might be something on the order of 14. I think this is on a mass basis, which means you need 14 times the amount of nitrogen as phosphorus. Now, knowing the optimal ratio helps you in understanding why some nutrients are more limiting than others. Let's say we have a plant that requires nutrients, two elements in the same amount. And so if they're required in the same amount, they're typically going to be taken up in the same ratio. And let's just say that ratio is 1 to 1. But if one of those elements is supplied at a ratio of 10 to 1, then the uptake is still going to be a 1 to 1 ratio, typically. And so therefore, although this element is being supplied at a much higher rate than the other, the actual cycling is constrained by the requirements of the plant. So when we say that the most strongly limiting nutrient limits the cycling of others, often what that means is that plants are going to try and take up most elements in the ratio that they're required, not that the ratio that they're supplied. And whichever element is most limiting is going to restrict the uptake of other elements. And so therefore, it limits the cycling of other elements.